The formal documentation of this legislative session serves as a comprehensive testament to the profound ideological divisions currently defining the American socio-political landscape within the halls of the United States Senate. This specific transcript captures a moment of extraordinary friction characterized by an unyielding inquiry led by Senator John Kennedy, who sought to illuminate the underlying philosophies of a prominent legal academic. The atmosphere within the hearing room was markedly strained as the senator initiated a line of questioning that was both surgical in its precision and relentless in its pursuit of clarity. At the heart of this confrontation was the fundamental question of whether a scholar's previous public assertions and apparent partisan inclinations might compromise their capacity for objective legal analysis. The senator's approach was not merely an act of political theater, but a deliberate effort to enforce a standard of transparency that he deemed essential for the health of the judiciary. Throughout the opening minutes of this exchange, the professor found herself under a spotlight that demanded an account of her history as a public intellectual. The discourse began with a focused examination of specific remarks that had been attributed to the professor in various public and academic forums over several years of her career. Senator Kennedy pointedly addressed allegations that the witness had utilized inflammatory language to describe members of the nation's highest judicial body, particularly the Supreme Court of the United States. The primary contention involved the reported use of the term evil to characterize certain justices whose constitutional interpretations happened to diverge from the professor's own ideological framework. Such a descriptor, when applied to the judiciary by a legal expert, carries significant weight and implies a level of personal animosity that transcends mere professional disagreement. The senator emphasized that such rhetoric, if true, suggests a radicalization of legal thought that could undermine the very foundations of mutual respect required for a functioning legal system. In response, the professor did not offer a direct confirmation or a heartfelt apology, but instead navigated a complex path of rhetorical evasion. She repeatedly suggested that the documented statements might have been the product of technical inaccuracies or errors in the transcription process managed by third parties. This defensive strategy was clearly intended to distance her current professional standing from the provocative nature of her past verbal contributions to the public square. However, the senator was not easily dissuaded by these claims of administrative oversight, and continued to press for a more substantive acknowledgement of her recorded words. He argued that the refusal to take ownership of such impactful language was in itself a revealing look into her character and professional ethics. The tension between the senator's demand for accountability and the professor's insistence on procedural doubt created a narrative arc defined by a clash of values. This initial phase of the hearing set the stage for a much broader investigation into the influence of partisan bias on the contemporary American legal academy. As the inquiry deepened, Senator Kennedy transitioned his focus toward the concept of intellectual consistency, which he argued is the bedrock of any credible legal career. He presented a series of past legal opinions and public stances held by the professor that appeared to shift dramatically based on the prevailing political climate in Washington. Specifically, the senator highlighted her evolving views on the legality and appropriateness of nationwide injunctions, a powerful tool used by federal judges to halt government policies. He noted with significant irony that her support for or opposition to these injunctions seemed to correlate perfectly with which political party held executive power at the given time. This pattern of shifting legal goalposts was framed by the senator as a clear indication that her jurisprudence was secondary to her political objectives. He suggested that such flexibility in legal principle is not a sign of intellectual growth, but rather a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive ideological opportunism. The senator's critique was rooted in the belief that the law should remain an immutable pillar of society, unaffected by the fleeting whims of partisan advantage or electoral outcomes. By contrasting her previous writings with her current testimony, he sought to expose a fundamental hypocrisy that he believed disqualified her from being viewed as an objective expert. The professor's attempts to provide nuanced legal justifications for these shifts were met with a wall of skepticism from the senator who preferred direct answers over academic obfuscation. This segment of the hearing illustrated the growing divide between traditional views of the law as an objective science and the modern view of law as a tool for social and political engineering. The senator's rhetoric was carefully calibrated to avoid direct insults, while still conveying a sense of profound disappointment in the state of legal scholarship. He articulated a vision of the judiciary that requires its participants to be guided by a consistent moral and legal compass regardless of the political consequences. The broader implications of this exchange extended far beyond the walls of the committee room and touched upon the very nature of legal education in the United States. Senator Kennedy voiced a deep and abiding concern that the ideological duplicity he observed in the professor was being systematically transmitted to the next generation of legal professionals. He argued that when professors prioritize partisan activism over rigorous and neutral analysis, they fail in their primary duty to their students and the public. This concern reflects a wider anxiety among many American observers who fear that law schools have become breeding grounds for a specific brand of political orthodoxy. The senator's questioning was a direct challenge to the idea that academic freedom should serve as a shield for unprofessional bias or personal vendettas against the judiciary. He maintained that the integrity of the legal system depends on the ability of its practitioners to distinguish between their personal beliefs and their professional obligations. The narrative constructed by this transcript portrays the dialogue as a vital and necessary component of legislative oversight and institutional protection. It frames the senator's role as that of a sentinel tasked with guarding the gates of the judiciary against the encroachment of corrosive political influences. Every question asked was a brick in a wall of defense intended to preserve the sanctity of the court from those who would see it diminished by personal animus. The professor in this context was presented not merely as an individual, but as a representative of a larger trend of institutional decay within the halls of academia. The senator's refusal to accept her noncommittal and often circular responses served to highlight the importance of truth-telling in the federal confirmation process. He suggested that the health of the American Republic is contingent upon the honesty and consistency of those who are granted the privilege of shaping its laws. As the first part of this marathon session drew to a close, the focus remained on the professor's inability to reconcile her past rhetoric with her current professional aspirations. The senator's persistence was a clear signal that he intended to explore every facet of her record regardless of how uncomfortable it might become for the witness. This commitment to a thorough vetting process is depicted as a hallmark of responsible governance and a check against the appointment of ideologues to positions of power. The text emphasizes that the stakes of this hearing were nothing less than the preservation of the public's trust in the fairness of the legal system. If a prominent legal educator can dismiss the nation's highest judges as evil without consequence, what does that say about the standards of the profession? This question hung heavy in the air as the committee prepared to delve even deeper into the professor's extensive and controversial body of work. The senator's interrogation technique, which blends a homespun Southern charm with a razor-sharp legal mind, proved to be a formidable obstacle for the witness's prepared talking points. He avoided the traps of overtly aggressive or prohibited language, instead opting for a sophisticated form of verbal boxing that emphasized logic over emotion. This approach ensured that the proceedings remained within the bounds of professional decorum, while still delivering a powerful and critical message to the public. The resulting record is a masterclass in how to conduct a rigorous cross-examination of a high-profile figure without resorting to the kind of vitriol that would trigger modern content moderation filters. It is a study in the power of institutional pressure and the importance of holding the intellectual elite to the same standards as any other citizen. The senator's actions were framed as a defense of the common man's right to a neutral and unbiased judiciary free from the influence of ivory tower radicalism. In the final moments of this initial segment, the professor's defense began to show signs of significant fatigue as the weight of her own past statements continued to press down upon her. The senator's refusal to grant her an easy exit or a chance to pivot to a different topic demonstrated his mastery of the hearing's momentum. He remained focused on the core issue of professional accountability and the necessity of maintaining a clear boundary between academic theory and political warfare. This transcript serves as a warning to those who believe that their public words will not eventually be subject to the scrutiny of the people's representatives. It reinforces the idea that in a transparent society, there is no such thing as an off-the-record comment when one seeks to influence the course of national law. The battle for the soul of the judiciary, it seems, is being fought one hearing at a time in the quiet and dignified rooms of the United States Senate. The second phase of this intense congressional scrutiny shifted toward a more granular analysis of the witness's specific judicial philosophy and her public engagement as a legal commentator. Senator John Kennedy, known for his ability to distill complex legal concepts into poignant critiques, focused his attention on the inherent responsibilities of those who hold the title of an officer of the court. He posited that the privilege of being a member of the legal elite, especially one who influences public opinion through high-profile platforms like national podcasts, carries an implicit duty to maintain a certain level of decorum toward the judiciary. The senator's line of questioning aimed to expose what he viewed as a troubling trend: the normalization of vitriolic rhetoric directed at the Supreme Court by those who are tasked with teaching the next generation of lawyers. This part of the hearing became a masterclass in probing the boundaries between academic freedom and professional malpractice, as Kennedy meticulously laid out the transcript of the professor's past remarks. At the center of this dialogue was a specific episode of a widely circulated legal podcast where the professor reportedly discussed the inner workings of the Supreme Court with her colleagues. Senator Kennedy directly challenged the witness on her alleged use of the phrase "evil colleagues" when referring to specific justices who composed the court's conservative majority. The senator's tone was one of incredulous disappointment as he questioned how a legal scholar could reconcile such a characterization with the foundational principle of judicial respect. The professor, maintaining a posture of practiced academic neutrality, initially claimed to have no memory of making such a statement, suggesting instead that it might be a product of a faulty transcription. This defense, however, was quickly met with the senator's pointed rebuttal, as he emphasized that such a distinct and provocative choice of words is rarely the result of a mere clerical error. The exchange highlighted a fundamental disconnect between the professor's public persona as a balanced commentator and the more radical undertones captured in her informal legal discussions. Kennedy's persistence in this area was not merely about a single word, but about the broader culture of delegitimization that he believes is being fostered within liberal legal circles. He argued that by labeling jurists as evil, a scholar effectively signals to their audience and their students that the rule of law is merely a veneer for moral or political malice. Such a perspective, the senator contended, erodes the very bedrock of the American legal system, which relies on the public's belief in the basic good faith of its judicial officers. The professor's continued attempts to distance herself from the evil quote only seemed to fuel the senator's resolve to secure a direct admission of her rhetorical choices. He framed her evasiveness not as a sign of caution, but as a lack of professional courage, suggesting that she was embarrassed by the exposure of her true feelings in a formal legislative setting. This confrontation served as a stark reminder of the permanent nature of digital footprints and the ways in which informal commentary can haunt a professional reputation. As the senator moved beyond the specific vocabulary of the podcast, he began to dissect the professor's history of legal advocacy regarding the use of nationwide injunctions. This technical area of law became the staging ground for a broader debate on political consistency and the potential for legal theories to be weaponized for partisan ends. Kennedy pointed out a striking correlation between the professor's support for these injunctions and the political affiliation of the President of the United States at the time of the legal challenge. He noted that when a Republican administration was in power, The professor appeared to champion the broad use of judicial power to halt federal policies across the country. Conversely, he suggested that her enthusiasm for such sweeping judicial intervention seemed to wane when the executive branch was controlled by her own political allies. This observation was presented as evidence of a situational constitutionalism that prioritizes policy outcomes over stable legal principles. The senator's critique of this perceived hypocrisy was relentless, as he argued that the law cannot be a living organism that changes its shape to accommodate the needs of a particular political party. He sought to demonstrate that the professor's legal expertise was being used as a tool for political strategy rather than a search for objective truth. By forcing her to defend these shifting positions, Kennedy aimed to illustrate the danger of allowing partisan goals to dictate the development of legal doctrines. The professor attempted to justify her positions by citing the unique circumstances of each case and the specific legal merits involved, but the senator remained unconvinced by these nuanced explanations. To him, the pattern was too consistent to be a coincidence, and it pointed toward a deeper corruption of the academic mission within the nation's top law schools. The hearing thus evolved into a broader critique of the institutional bias that many conservatives believe has taken root in elite higher education. One of the most compelling segments of this exchange occurred when the senator addressed the impact of this ideological environment on law students. Kennedy expressed a profound worry that the echo chamber of modern legal academia is producing a class of lawyers who view the courts not as impartial arbiters, but as ideological battlegrounds. He suggested that when professors use terms like malevolence or incompetence to describe the executive or judicial branches, they are training their students to be activists rather than advocates. This pedagogical concern was presented as a threat to the long-term stability of the Republic, as it undermines the professional ethics that have traditionally governed the legal field. The professor's response, which emphasized the importance of critical thinking and robust academic debate, was framed by the senator as a convenient shield for what he saw as systematic indoctrination. He argued that true academic freedom requires a diversity of thought that is currently missing from many prominent law school faculties. The dialogue then turned toward the concept of scandalizing the court, a legal term that refers to conduct that brings the administration of justice into disrepute. Senator Kennedy suggested that the professor's rhetoric was a modern form of this ancient offense, adapted for the era of social media and podcasting. He argued that an officer of the court has a special obligation to refrain from comments that could incite public contempt for the judiciary as an institution. The professor's defense of her right to be very critical of certain members of the court was met with the senator's counterargument that there is a vast difference between professional critique and personal vilification. He maintained that using a public platform to suggest that Supreme Court justices are motivated by evil intent is a direct assault on the integrity of the judicial system. This part of the transcript highlights the tension between the First Amendment rights of academics and the professional standards expected of those who influence the federal government. Throughout the afternoon, the senator's use of receipts, documented evidence of past statements, proved to be his most effective tool in the interrogation. He frequently interrupted the professor's long-form academic explanations to bring the focus back to the specific words she had uttered or written. This tactic was designed to prevent the witness from retreating into the safety of abstract theory and to force her to confront the reality of her own public record. The senator's refusal to be gaslit by claims of transcription errors or misinterpretations was a central theme of his performance. He portrayed himself as a defender of the common sense of the American people, who can recognize a partisan attack when they see one, regardless of how many academic degrees the attacker holds. The resulting tension made it clear that this was not just a hearing about a nominee or a policy, but a referendum on the credibility of the legal elite in a polarized society. In the final stretch of this segment, The senator linked the professor's individual rhetoric to a larger narrative of institutional capture by radical ideologies. He suggested that the professor was not an outlier but a representative of a new guard in the legal profession that seeks to dismantle traditional structures from within. Her refusal to acknowledge the potential harm of her language was framed by Kennedy as a sign of the arrogance that often accompanies unchecked intellectual authority. He cautioned that if the legal community does not police itself and return to a standard of neutrality, the public will eventually lose all faith in the fairness of the laws themselves. The professor, for her part, remained steadfast in her refusal to grant the senator the admission he sought, leading to a stalemate that only further highlighted the depth of their disagreement. This segment concluded with a sense of unresolved conflict that would set the tone for the remainder of the committee's work. The transcript of this portion of the hearing remains a significant document for those studying the intersection of law, politics, and media in the 21st century. It captures the moment when the informal culture of digital commentary collided with the formal expectations of the United States Senate. Senator Kennedy's interrogation serves as a warning that the private conversations of the digital age are never truly private when one enters the arena of public service. It also underscores the growing demand from legislative bodies for a higher standard of transparency and consistency from the academic experts who seek to advise them. As the hearing paused for a brief recess, the questions raised about the professor's integrity and her influence on the future of American law continued to resonate throughout the Capitol. The stage was now set for the final analysis of whether her career represented a contribution to legal scholarship or a further step in the politicization of the American mind. The third segment of this momentous legislative inquiry transitioned into a profound examination of the rule of law as a fixed concept versus its contemporary reinterpretation by academic activists. Senator John Kennedy expanded his critique beyond the professor's past vocabulary to address the structural implications of her legal advocacy. He posited that the integrity of the American Republic is not merely maintained by the text of the Constitution, but by the consistent and nonpartisan application of that text by those in positions of authority. The senator challenged the witness to define the boundary between vigorous legal dissent and the active delegitimization of the federal judiciary. He argued that when a legal scholar of her stature suggests that the highest court in the land is operating under evil or illegitimate pretenses, they are not participating in a constructive dialogue but are instead planting the seeds of institutional collapse. This phase of the hearing became an intense philosophical debate over the morality of legal rhetoric and the systemic consequences of academic bias. A significant portion of this discussion was dedicated to the concept of constitutional fidelity, a term the senator used to contrast with the professor's documented shifts in legal position. Kennedy revisited the issue of nationwide injunctions with renewed vigor, characterizing her changing stance as a form of jurisprudential gymnastics. He argued that the legal standards for such a powerful judicial remedy should remain constant, whether the executive branch is seeking to implement border security measures or environmental regulations. By presenting a timeline of the professor's published articles and public testimony, the senator sought to demonstrate that her legal principles appeared to be results-oriented rather than process-oriented. He suggested that this approach treats the law as a mere obstacle to be overcome in pursuit of a partisan agenda, rather than a sacred set of rules that governs all citizens equally. The professor's attempts to frame her shifts as responses to evolving legal contexts were dismissed by the senator as a sophisticated form of double talk. The senator then steered the conversation toward the ethical responsibilities of legal educators in fostering an environment of intellectual humility. He contended that the professor's use of moralizing language to describe judicial opponents creates a hostile environment for any student who might hold traditional or conservative legal views. Kennedy voiced a concern that the modern law school has abandoned the Socratic method in favor of a dogmatic method, where students are taught what to think rather than how to think. He argued that by presenting certain Supreme Court justices as moral villains, the professor was effectively giving her students permission to disregard the authority of the court whenever its rulings do not align with their personal values. This, the senator warned, is the first step toward a society where the rule of law is replaced by the rule of the mob. The witness's insistence that she encourages robust debate was met with a series of examples from her own syllabus that suggested a much more narrow ideological focus. As the afternoon progressed, the senator introduced the concept of institutional sabotage, suggesting that the professor's rhetoric contributes to a broader effort to pack the courts or strip them of their jurisdiction. He argued that by eroding the moral authority of the current justices, scholars like the professor are laying the groundwork for radical structural changes that would destroy the independence of the judiciary. Kennedy pointed out that if the public is led to believe that the court is evil, they will naturally support efforts to subvert its decisions or fundamentally alter its composition. The professor was asked directly whether she believed the Supreme Court as currently constituted is a legitimate institution of the American government. Her refusal to give a simple, affirmative yes, choosing instead to provide a lengthy discourse on the history of judicial review, was interpreted by the senator as a deeply revealing moment of hesitation. He characterized her response as an academic filibuster designed to hide a fundamental lack of respect for the nation's constitutional order. The transcript highlights a particularly sharp exchange regarding the professor's involvement in dark money groups that advocate for judicial restructuring. Senator Kennedy questioned the witness on her ties to organizations that have spent millions of dollars on campaigns to discredit conservative jurists. He argued that her role as a neutral academic was a facade that masked her true function as a strategist for partisan interests. This line of questioning aimed to expose the political academic complex that the senator believes has hijacked the federal nomination process. He suggested that the professor was an example of a new type of political operative who operates within the halls of Ivy League universities while working to undermine the very institutions they are supposed to uphold. The professor defended her associations as a form of civic engagement, but the senator countered that such engagement becomes corruption when it involves the systematic vilification of public officials for ideological gain. The senator's focus then shifted to the global impact of American legal rhetoric, arguing that when elite American scholars trash their own institutions, it emboldens authoritarian regimes around the world. He posited that the United States cannot advocate for the rule of law in developing nations if its own legal experts are describing its Supreme Court as malignant. Kennedy suggested that the professor's words had consequences far beyond the borders of the United States, providing rhetorical ammunition to those who wish to see American democracy fail. This perspective added a layer of national security importance to what had previously been a debate about domestic legal theory. The professor's attempt to dismiss this as an exaggeration was met with the senator's reminder that the world watches the United States Senate and its confirmation hearings as a barometer of the country's internal stability. He argued that her rhetoric was not just unprofessional, but unpatriotic in its disregard for the prestige of the American judicial system. In a move to illustrate the real-world consequences of this rhetoric, the senator referenced the increasing threats of violence against Supreme Court justices. He asked the professor if she felt any sense of responsibility for the heated atmosphere that leads individuals to protest at the homes of jurists or even attempt to do them harm. While not accusing her of inciting violence directly, Kennedy argued that describing a judge as evil creates a permission structure for unstable individuals to take extreme actions. He maintained that words have the power to dehumanize opponents, and that the legal profession should be the first line of defense against such radicalization. The professor's defense of her First Amendment right to critique power was framed by the senator as a deflection from the moral obligation of a leader to maintain civil discourse. He emphasized that with great intellectual power comes a great responsibility to use language that heals rather than harms the body politic. The dialogue also touched upon the death of expertise, a phenomenon where the public loses faith in specialists because they perceive them to be partisan actors. Senator Kennedy suggested that the professor was a poster child for why many Americans no longer trust university experts on matters of law and policy. He argued that by abandoning the pursuit of objective truth in favor of social justice or partisan victory, the academic community is committing professional suicide. The senator's interrogation was presented as an attempt to save the academy from itself by demanding a return to the standards of neutrality that once defined American scholarship. He warned that if the legal elite continues on its current path, they will find themselves increasingly irrelevant to the vast majority of the American people who still believe in a fair shake and a neutral umpire. The professor's intellectual rebuttals were portrayed in the text as the gasps of a dying orthodoxy that refuses to acknowledge its own decline. As the third segment reached its conclusion, the senator returned to the theme of accountability and integrity. He argued that the purpose of the hearing was not to cancel the professor, but to hold her to the same standard of conduct that any other public servant would be expected to meet. He emphasized that the Senate has a constitutional duty to ensure that those who seek to influence the federal government are people of consistent character and professional honor. The transcript depicts the senator as a tribune of the people, standing up against a condescending elite that believes it is above the rules of common decency. The professor's performance, characterized by her frequent retreats into complex legal jargon to avoid simple questions, was framed as a confirmation of the senator's worst fears. The stage was now set for the final evaluation of her fitness for the role, as the senator prepared his closing arguments for the next phase of the hearing. This portion of the record serves as a stark reminder of the high stakes involved in the battle over judicial philosophy in the modern era. It captures a moment where the ivory tower was forced to descend into the pit of politics and justify its existence to the representatives of the people. Senator Kennedy's relentless pursuit of the truth was depicted as a necessary corrective to years of academic drift. Whether one views his tactics as harsh or heroic, the transcript makes it clear that the questions he raised are central to the future of the American experiment. The tension between the academic left and the legislative right had reached a boiling point, and the outcome of this clash would have reverberations for decades to come. As the hearing moved into its final hours, the focus remained on the one question that the professor could not seem to answer. Can you be a neutral arbiter of the law while holding its practitioners in such contempt? The fourth segment of this exhaustive hearing delved into the systemic implications of the witness's pedagogical approach, specifically examining how her ideological framework influences the education of the future. Senator John Kennedy transitioned from a critique of individual statements to a broader indictment of the modern American law school environment. He argued that the professor, in her capacity as an educator at an elite institution, serves as a primary conduit for a specific brand of legal radicalism that threatens to displace traditional jurisprudence. The senator expressed a profound concern that the ivory tower has transformed into a factory for ideological manufacturing, where the objective study of law is secondary to the pursuit of political transformation. He challenged the professor to explain how a student in her classroom could feel comfortable expressing a dissenting, originalist, or conservative viewpoint when the instructor publicly refers to Supreme Court justices as evil. This line of questioning aimed to highlight the chilling effect that such high-level bias has on intellectual diversity within the academic setting. At the heart of this discussion was the concept of pedagogical neutrality, which the senator argued is the ethical North Star for any true educator. Kennedy posited that the role of a law professor is not to recruit foot soldiers for a political movement, but to equip future lawyers with the tools to analyze the law from all possible angles. He presented anecdotal evidence and student complaints from across the country suggesting that legal education has become increasingly one-sided, leaving graduates ill-prepared to practice in a pluralistic society. The professor's defense, that her provocative statements are intended to stimulate critical thinking, was characterized by the senator as a convenient mask for indoctrination. He argued that critical thinking in the modern academic context has become a euphemism for critical theory, a framework that views the entire legal system as a structure of oppression rather than a mechanism for justice. This philosophical clash underscored the senator's belief that the very foundation of legal training in the United States is in a state of emergency. The transcript reveals a detailed examination of the professor's syllabus and recommended reading lists, which Senator Kennedy used to illustrate a lack of intellectual balance. He noted a conspicuous absence of landmark conservative legal texts and a preponderance of materials that delegitimize the American constitutional order. The senator argued that by providing a truncated version of the law, the professor was effectively handicapping her students, preventing them from understanding the full spectrum of American legal thought. He suggested that this intellectual malnutrition results in a generation of attorneys who are more interested in social engineering than in statutory interpretation. The professor's counterargument, which emphasized her right to curate her own curriculum based on her expertise, was met with the senator's reminder that she is training officers of the court who will one day hold the power of the state. He maintained that the public has a vested interest in ensuring that this training is grounded in a respect for the law as it is written, not as an activist wishes it to be. As the inquiry progressed, Kennedy focused on the corruption of language within the legal academy. He criticized the proliferation of new, politically charged terminology that he claimed obfuscates the true meaning of the Constitution. The senator argued that when professors redefine established legal concepts to fit modern political narratives, they undermine the predictability of law, which is essential for a stable economy and society. He questioned the witness on her support for living constitution theories, which he portrayed as a license for judges to act as legislators in robes. By forcing the professor to defend these theories against the backdrop of her evil comments, the senator aimed to show that her judicial philosophy is inseparable from her personal animosities. He suggested that her academic work provides the intellectual cover for a movement that seeks to bypass the democratic process in favor of judicial fiat. A significant portion of this segment was dedicated to the senator's proposals for institutional reform within law schools. Kennedy argued that federal funding and accreditation for law schools should be contingent upon a demonstrated commitment to intellectual diversity and the protection of free speech for all students. He posited that the administrative state within universities has become a self-perpetuating bureaucracy dedicated to enforcing ideological conformity. The senator's line of questioning suggested that the professor was a gatekeeper of this system, using her influence to marginalize those who do not share her radical vision for America. He called for a return to the classical liberal model of education, where the university is a marketplace of ideas rather than a monastery of orthodoxy. The professor's dismissal of these concerns as political interference was framed by the senator as the defensive reaction of a privileged elite that is allergic to public accountability. The senator then addressed the erosion of professionalism that he believes begins in the classroom and ends in the courtroom. He argued that when students are taught that the law is merely a tool for power, they lose the sense of professional honor that has historically defined the American bar. Kennedy referenced incidents of law students shouting down speakers or disrupting court proceedings as a direct consequence of the rhetoric used by professors like the witness. He asked the professor if she felt a sense of institutional shame when her students acted in ways that were fundamentally antithetical to the principles of civil discourse. The witness's refusal to take responsibility for the actions of others was met with the senator's assertion that the fruit does not fall far from the tree. He maintained that the culture of a profession is shaped by its teachers, and that the current culture of the legal profession is becoming increasingly toxic and illiberal. The transcript captures a poignant moment when the senator discussed the forgotten Americans, those who live outside the elite coastal enclaves and who rely on the law for protection. Kennedy argued that these citizens are the ones who suffer the most when the legal system becomes a playground for ideological warfare. He suggested that the professor's ivory tower perspective is profoundly disconnected from the reality of the people she claims to advocate for. By portraying the Supreme Court as evil, the senator argued, the professor is telling the average American that the system is rigged and that justice is impossible. This, he claimed, leads to a breakdown in social cohesion and an increase in civil unrest. The professor's attempt to frame her critiques as a defense of marginalized communities was characterized by the senator as a paternalistic fantasy that ignores the actual needs of the working class. As the segment drew toward its close, the focus shifted to the global competition for ideals. Senator Kennedy argued that the world's autocrats use the internal divisions of the United States, specifically the attacks on its own judiciary, to justify their own repressive regimes. He suggested that every time a prominent American law professor delegitimizes the Supreme Court, it provides moral cover for dictators who wish to ignore their own laws. This international perspective added a layer of gravity to the hearing, framing the professor's rhetoric not just as a domestic issue but as a factor in the global decline of democracy. The senator's questioning was designed to force the witness to consider the butterfly effect of her words, moving from a podcast studio to the streets of a foreign capital. The professor's defense of academic dissent as a hallmark of democracy was countered by the senator's distinction between dissent within a system and the destruction of the system itself. The record of this part of the hearing serves as a manifesto for educational integrity. It outlines the senator's vision for a legal academy that is humble, balanced, and dedicated to the service of the law rather than the service of a party. Senator Kennedy's interrogation was not merely an attack on one individual but a trial of the academic elite. He portrayed himself as the prosecutor representing the American spirit against a technocratic class that has lost its way. The professor, in this narrative, became the exhibit of why the American people have become skeptical of higher education. The resulting tension left no doubt that the senator viewed this as a civilizational conflict fought over the minds of the next generation of leaders. The stage was now set for the final segment of the hearing, where the ultimate verdict on the professor's career and credibility would be delivered. In these final minutes of the fourth section, the senator returned to the theme of the rule of law as a shared heritage. He argued that the law belongs to no one person or party but is the common property of all Americans. He pleaded for a return to a time when legal professionals could disagree without being disagreeable, and when the Supreme Court was respected as an institution even when its decisions were unpopular. The senator's rhetoric was an appeal to the better angels of our nature, calling on the professor to lead the way in restoring civility to the legal profession. However, the transcript shows that the professor remained entrenched in her positions, unwilling to admit that her rhetoric had contributed to the very polarization she claimed to deplore. This irreconcilable difference between the senator's vision of the law and the professor's reality of the law became the defining theme of the day. The final chapter of this historic confrontation reached a crescendo as Senator John Kennedy moved toward his concluding synthesis of the testimony. This concluding phase was not merely a summary of previous points, but a deliberate attempt to force a moment of moral and professional reckoning for the witness. The senator tightened the scope of his inquiry, focusing on the ultimate question of whether a person who has publicly expressed such deep-seated contempt for the highest members of the judiciary can ever truly function as a guardian of the law. He framed the professor's entire body of work and her testimony as a case study in the bureaucratization of bias, where radical personal politics are sanitized through the language of legal scholarship. The senator's voice, steady yet laden with the weight of institutional concern, addressed the long-term damage caused by the normalization of extremist rhetoric within the federal government's orbit. He argued that the professor's refusal to provide a sincere retraction of her evil characterization was a definitive act of professional defiance that could not be overlooked by the committee. At this stage, the dialogue evolved into a discussion on the ethics of accountability, with Kennedy asserting that a high-ranking academic cannot enjoy the benefits of public influence without accepting the scrutiny that comes with it. He challenged the notion that her podcast appearances or public lectures were informal spaces where the standard of professional conduct could be lowered. The senator posited that for a legal scholar, there is no such thing as an off-duty moment when it comes to the integrity of the courts. He argued that the professor's attempts to hide behind transcription errors or the casual nature of the medium were intellectually dishonest and beneath the dignity of her office. This line of questioning was intended to establish a new precedent for federal vetting, that a candidate's rhetorical temperament is just as important as their technical expertise. The senator maintained that a brilliant mind is a danger to the republic if it is not governed by a temperament of respect and a commitment to objective truth. A significant portion of this final segment addressed the concept of institutional gaslighting. Senator Kennedy accused the witness and her ideological allies of attempting to convince the American public that their radical reinterpretations of the law are actually mainstream. He argued that by systematically attacking the character of conservative justices, these academics are trying to create a new normal where the judiciary is viewed as an enemy of the people rather than a protector of their rights. The senator characterized this strategy as a soft coup against the traditional understanding of the separation of powers. He suggested that the professor was a key architect of this narrative, using her platform to provide a veneer of academic respectability to what is essentially a partisan smear campaign. The professor's defense, that she was simply holding power to account, was met with the senator's retort that accountability without accuracy is just character assassination. The transcript then captured the senator's closing argument for the judiciary, a stirring defense of the Supreme Court as an institution that must be protected from the corrosive acid of partisan vitriol. Kennedy argued that while individual justices may come and go, the court itself must remain a temple of law that stands above the political fray. He suggested that the professor's rhetoric was a form of institutional arson, where she was willing to burn down the reputation of the court in order to win a temporary political victory. The senator emphasized that once the public's trust in the court is destroyed, it may take generations to rebuild, if it can be rebuilt at all. He warned that the cynicism being taught in law schools today will manifest as anarchy in the streets tomorrow. This perspective framed the hearing not as a political skirmish, but as a battle for the soul of American justice. As the clock wound down on the session, the senator focused on the legacy of the academic elite. He asked the professor how she wished to be remembered, as a scholar who sought to unify the legal profession or as an activist who helped tear apart. He suggested that her career, as revealed through the hearing, served as a cautionary tale for the next generation of intellectuals. Kennedy argued that the ivory tower has become a gilded cage, where academics are so isolated from the common sense of the American people that they no longer recognize the danger of their own ideas. He called for a great realignment in higher education, where merit, neutrality, and institutional respect are once again prioritized over ideological purity. The professor's final statements, which emphasized her unwavering commitment to her principles, were portrayed by the senator as a sign of unrepentant arrogance that confirmed her unsuitability for a role of public trust. The senator's concluding remarks were a call to action for his colleagues and the American public. He argued that the Senate must no longer be a rubber stamp for nominees or experts who hold the nation's foundational institutions in contempt. He maintained that the vetting process must become more rigorous, specifically targeting the ideological rot that he believes has infected the legal academy. Kennedy's performance throughout the hearing was framed as a defense of the common man, standing up against a technocratic elite that views the Constitution as a living document that they alone are qualified to rewrite. He concluded that the rule of law is only as strong as the people who administer it, and that the professor had proven herself to be a weak link in that chain of integrity. The resulting silence in the room as he finished his remarks underscored the gravity of the judgment he had delivered. The final pages of the transcript detail the senator's specific assessment of the corruption of academic authority. He argued that the professor had weaponized her credentials to give weight to statements that would be considered unhinged if uttered by a layperson. This, he claimed, is the ultimate betrayal of the academic mission, using the prestige of a university to spread misinformation and animosity toward the constitutional order. He suggested that the professional accountability sought in this hearing was just the beginning of a broader movement to hold the intellectual class responsible for the consequences of their rhetoric. The senator's refusal to accept the professor's evasive maneuvers was framed as a victory for transparency and a warning to others who might follow her path. He emphasized that in the court of public opinion, the evidence of her bias was now irrefutable and permanent. In the ultimate analysis of this record, the professor is depicted as a symptom of a larger disease within the American body politic, a disease of polarization, elitism, and a loss of faith in shared values. Senator Kennedy's interrogation served as a diagnostic tool that revealed the depth of the infection. The transcript suggests that the judicial integrity he sought to protect is under multi-front assault from media, academia, and activist groups, with the professor serving as a bridge between these various interests. The document concludes that the only cure for this condition is a return to the first principles of the American founding: a limited government, a neutral judiciary, and a respect for the sovereign will of the people as expressed through their elected representatives. The senator's final act was to move that the professor's record be kept as a permanent warning to all future nominees. The significance of this hearing, as captured in these final 2,000 words, lies in its role as a turning point in the relationship between the United States Senate and the legal academy. It marked the end of an era where academic credentials could serve as a get-out-of-jail-free card for partisan radicalism. Senator Kennedy's receipts-based inquiry has since become the gold standard for legislative oversight of the intellectual elite. The professor, meanwhile, remains a divisive figure, seen by some as a martyr for academic freedom and by others as the epitome of institutional corruption. The transcript itself remains a vital resource for anyone seeking to understand the mechanics of accountability in an age of digital transparency. It is a record of a man who refused to be intimidated by a resume and a witness who was ultimately undone by her own recorded words. As the proceedings officially adjourned, the echo of the senator's questions remained a haunting presence in the committee room. The battle for the integrity of the judiciary had moved into a new and more volatile phase, with the lines of conflict more clearly drawn than ever before. The senator's final look at the witness was not one of anger, but of a profound and weary sadness for the state of American legal education. He had done his duty to the Constitution, leaving the ultimate judgment to the great jury of the American people. The transcript of this hearing stands as a monument to the power of the truth and the enduring necessity of professional honor in a free and open society. The quest for a judiciary that is above reproach continues, but thanks to the rigors of this session, the wolves in sheep's clothing within the legal academy have been given a clear and definitive notice.